And we've been conditioned really to write women out of history. And more recently, I'm thinking of Me Too and Time's Up, and we're putting women back into history.
My name is Ben Charland, and you're listening to What on Earth is Going On. My guest this week is Sally Armstrong, award-winning author, journalist, and human rights activist who has focused her work since the 1980s on women and girls in the world's conflict zones. Her books include Ascent of Women and Veiled Threat, The Hidden Power of the Women of Afghanistan. She has a new book coming out in October of 2019 called Power Shift, The Longest Revolution, which is about, of course, the women's revolution. Here is the publisher's blurb for that book. The facts are indisputable. When women get even a bit of education, the whole of society improves. When they get a bit of health care, everyone lives longer. In many ways, it has been a better time to be a woman. A fundamental shift has been occurring. Yet from Toronto to Timbuktu, the promise of equality still eludes half the world's population. Now that description is pretty close to a lot of the things that we talk about in this conversation. We talk about the status of women around the world and how women are often missing from the data. They're written out of history. She even references a book that I talk about quite a bit on this show called Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari, which is interesting because what she says about that book is that Harari neglects to write women into history at all. She talks about how there is one central story of women's empowerment, rather than fragmented pieces all around the world. She also gets into the details about what's really going on in Afghanistan, the destruction of history, and in particular an excellent story about the destruction of the Buddhist statues of Bamiyan, which were destroyed by the Taliban. We talk about populism being a virus, and how being illiterate is almost the same thing as being blind. We talk about Syria, the White Helmets rescue that was organized by Canada. We talk about language, the importance of dialogue, and we even get to Sally's advice to women and girls. Her final point in this program is probably the most important to her, which is that we should be doing more. That's probably the central theme of Sally's writing over the years. Why are we standing back when the whole world could be different because of our actions? And by different, she means, of course, better. It's a really interesting conversation, and I hope you let me know what you think. You can go to the website at any time, whatonearthisgoingon.ca, listen to any episode, give me feedback on any episode or this one, and of course, send me an email with your suggestions for future guests or future subjects to tackle on this show. Again, that's whatonearthisgoingon.ca, and you can find my email address or links to social media at that website. Sally Armstrong, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
I'm really, really stoked to have you on the show and really excited to have you here at Over Easy, which is a breakfast place here in Toronto. Part of the reason for that is because, and I knew you'd be comfortable in a place like this, if only because you've done so many interviews of your own in much, much more difficult settings, situations, circumstances, in conflict zones around the world. In fact, you're called often a war correspondent for the world's women. Is that right?
I like that, yes.
I think it's, I don't think it's all of what you do. You've done so much, whether it's documentary films or you've been an editor of all kinds of, I think it was Housemaking magazine, is that right?
Homemakers.
Mm-hmm. But it was interesting because in the 1980s, you went on your first assignment to Liberia, and then from that point on, there was almost no turning back from your need to go and talk to women around the world who are in very difficult circumstances. And I think that you've earned the admiration that you've received in Canada and around the world.
Well, thank you.
Well, thank you for coming. So anyways, the first question is always the same, Sally, and I'm going to pitch it to you now. And it is a deliberately broad question for a deliberately broad response. So, Sally, what on earth is going on?
Well, I can tell you what on earth is going on because I can speak for half the earth. I am preparing right now the Massey Lectures for 2019, which means I am examining the status of women around the world. And not only that, I'm taking it back to actually the cave dwellers. How did women become second-class citizens? And who sustained that for all those many years? And where are we with that today? and what do we have to do to get to tomorrow? So I am immersed in this kind of research and that kind of writing. And Ben, I'm loving it because it calls on all those women and girls I've been interviewing for all these years, and I'm able to revisit them and find out what changes are happening in their lives. So for me, what on earth is going on? That's what's going on.
That is such a wonderful thing, because for me, the Massey lectures have always been one of the things out there that answers the question, what on earth is going on, in a very broad and yet incisive way. And the first one I listened to is Ronald Wright's A Short History of Progress.
Yes, I read that one.
In 2004, and that was mind-blowing for me at the time. I mean, I think I was still in university at the time when I first heard it and then read it. And to understand, and again, it's that wide scope, going back through what he calls the shipwrecks of history to find out where we've gone wrong, and that what makes us unique today is that we have access to those shipwrecks. We didn't have access to them at other points in our history. Is there a similarity here with the study of the history of women and how we can look back and see the mistakes of the past, how we can correct them today? Or is it a different sort of story where this unfolding progress of gender equality is happening?
Do you know what? You touch on a very important topic, and I can even come back to the books you've just mentioned. The problem I'm finding for women, and we are definitely in the best place we've been so far today, and we are definitely moving toward the finish line in the equality stakes. But when you look back, you find women are missing in the data. They're missing because the archaeologists and the anthropologists examined their findings with a male lens. There simply wasn't a woman's lens. Even Ron Wright's History of Progress, which is one of the best books I've ever read, there's no mention of women in the book. And it's the history of progress. Sapiens, this bestseller, doesn't mention women. So, and we've been conditioned really to write women out of history. And more recently, I'm thinking of Me Too and Time's Up and the really current actions, we're putting women back into history. But that's what happened in the past. For example, I can tell you, I don't want to give away all my stories, but cave art. We've been fascinated by cave art, haven't we? And there was a presumption that it was done by men. And now, with new techniques and better analysis, plus women anthropologists and women archaeologists, they're re-examining this and finding out it was done by women. And all those handprints that are all over those caves, why are they there? You know what I think? I think they're there because that's what we do. We put our mark somewhere and we say, this is me. I was here. Don't forget me. And I think the re-examination of these artifacts are really telling us a lot about the past and informing us about how women did manage to get, first of all, left out and then oppressed.
In your book, The Ascent of Women, which was, I think, published in 2013, you presaged really the Me Too movement. You called it, as you've said, the Me Too movement that we've been experiencing for the past year or so. And one thing that you talk about in that book is how necessary the empowerment of women is for our general progress as a species, as a civilization, as a society, whatever way you want to dice it. In fact, you quote Jeffrey Sachs in saying that the status of women is inextricably linked to the economy. In fact, the more empowered women are, the better your economy will be. And I remember Christopher Hitchens said that in his lifetime many times, that if you want to solve your problems, whether it's sewage or murder or rampant disruption or corruption, empower women. That is always, always the solution. And you touch on that in your book, but there is a question that the book raises. Because you're going around the world talking to women in whether it's Zambia or Bosnia or wherever, all these places that you've been, we get the impression that the progress of women is at different stages around the world. That, say, in Afghanistan, where you have, and you've written a book about this, The Veiled Threat, I believe, where women are much, much more subjugated in a very overt way compared to, say, Canada, Toronto, looking out the window here at this breakfast place. Now, does that mean that the story is fragmented and not united, or is there one central story here of women's progress, liberation, and development?
I think actually the latter is true. That it is a central story, even in Afghanistan, and we could use that as a great example for news today. For example, the United States negotiating with the Taliban for a peace in Afghanistan is so over the top in terms of hubris. It's hard to even discuss without getting crazed. Imagine that they ignore the government of Afghanistan. They throw the women of Afghanistan under the bus. After you speak of a central issue, the whole world paid attention to the women of Afghanistan, not during the Taliban. I was there all during the Taliban, and there were very few even reporters there during the Taliban. It was when 9/11 happened that suddenly the world appeared, and then they tripped over these burqa-clad women, and that was a flashpoint to the media. But since then, look what has been invested in Afghanistan. The billions of dollars invested in creating governance, in putting in institutions that people can trust, in getting the kids back to school. All those things, and a great deal has happened. Do you know that in Afghanistan today, life expectancy has gone from 47 years to 62 years.
Wow.
In the almost 20 years since the world has been there. Maternal mortality has dropped 75%. There's 9.6 million children back in school, 39% of them girls. These are huge steps forward, but the security in the place is catastrophic because you have 5 different insurgencies coming in with suicide bombers, with bombing public buildings, scaring the people to pieces, but it's not stopping the place. If you read about Afghanistan, you probably get the idea it's an armed camp and nothing's going on. The traffic is as chaotic as ever. I was there not so long ago. The schools are stuffed with kids. The businesses are moving, but you can't invest there. You can't grow the country because the security is so bad. So is there a central movement? Indeed, because the women of Afghanistan shed their burqas and looked into a computer and said, the rest of the world doesn't live like we live. Why are we living like this? And once you ask that question, you begin to move on to a whole series of developments that are probably very good for you.
I think you're right, and that's a fascinating insight, really, and I think the internet is a big part of this, or social media, the connection of women around the world to share stories and understand what the circumstances are like in other places, how different they could be, but also what the commonalities might be. And I guess another question that's raised in what you just said, I watched your interview with Peter Mansbridge, where he was showing you interviewing boys, essentially, in a prison in Iraq who were members of ISIS. One of whom actually said that because you said it responded to a question about religion, saying that you didn't really have one, he went like, he did the gesture of cutting your throat. And you later said, of course, that, well, that wasn't an appropriate place to talk about religion. But still, that action that essentially said if you weren't in prison, he might have done that to you. And my question is, with all of this progress that's happening in a place like Afghanistan or even Iraq or any of these countries, a 33% growth in life expectancy, for example, as you just mentioned, is that progress felt by people on the ground? And if it's felt, then why are these boys still doing things that are essentially throwing away their lives because they feel they don't have one? Is there, this stuff always happens, but why is it happening in light of the progress? In fact, in spite of the progress?
You know, I wish I had the answer for you because that is a very complicated situation. But let me start at the beginning of your comment. The women know they're on the move. They know there's a line out there that they need to cross, and they're doing everything they can to get across that line. They're going to school. They're learning. They're taking part in civil organizations. They're doing what you need to do. And that's not only in Afghanistan. It's everywhere I'm working. It's all over the world. Even these Yazidi girls that I interviewed in Iraq who were sex slaves, for heaven's sakes, are already trying to alter their futures. And they know. You know, the internet has collected all of us together. They know what's available. They know how. Look at that young girl from Saudi Arabia who barricaded herself in a hotel room in, what country was it? I can't remember right now.
She was on her way back home, was she? I think.
She was, and they were in Qatar, I think, and she took off. In any case, she barricaded herself in a hotel room. This girl knew exactly how to use social media to try to get herself rescued. And women and girls around the world, even those who are illiterate, are more aware of the passages open to them today. But then you come back to why do these people form groups to destroy, to kill, ISIS is not the only one. Boko Haram is doing it. The Taliban is doing it. People who seem to have this level of misogyny that is dragging the world down with them. As I interviewed those young men in the prison in Iraq, I was stunned. They were, when we see them on the street, they've got these Darth Vader outfits on, and they're shouting and calling for the death of this and that one, and these massive black beards. I sometimes think they backcomb the beards to make themselves look more fierce. But in the prison, they had to shave off the beard. They had to ditch the Darth Vader clothes, and they were in jeans and a T-shirt when I met them. So help me, they look like students of hotel management. So why were they so misguided? A couple of them, you could tell, were brainwashed to the point of pure hatred. But most of them, you had to ask yourself, why did you make such a stupid decision? And you wound up here. So I think that exists, but I think it's going to exist anywhere.
On a personal level, what was their answer to that question of why?
They all had a reason. I was looking for a job. I thought I was helping. I'm serving my God. And I asked them if they were sorry. They're sorry they're in prison. That's pretty much the... But by now, that was some time ago, by now that ISIS has collapsed, there'll be thousands more, probably in that very prison.
One of the themes with ISIS or Boko Haram is obviously the lack of opportunity, whether it's economic opportunity or opportunity in the community, this sense that you are surplus as opposed to critical to your society. And one response that organizations like ISIS has is to destroy history. And I think that it's really, really key that you're talking about history, going all the way back to the Stone Age and trying to figure out where things changed and women became second-class citizens in so many respects. Not even citizens in some cases, but slaves to men. And of course, we look back 100,000 years ago to human history before the so-called Stone Age, and we realize that we were quite egalitarian, that maybe it was both men and women putting their hands on the wall, and it wouldn't have mattered because there wasn't the same kind of distinction that we have today. But what an organization like ISIS does, and they've done it literally, is to destroy history, to destroy heritage. And someone like Naomi Klein, who's also a Torontonian, has said that history is the only way we have to understand how to move forward. And if we don't have history, then we will be susceptible to dictators, to hatred, to fear. How important is history to your work? And it's not immediately apparent for you as a journalist, immediately apparent before you open one of your books. But as soon as I open one of your books, you get right into history. How important is history to your work and to everything that we're talking about?
Well, I cover women. I cover women and girls in zones of conflict. I want to know, that's my beat. I want to know what's happening to them. You can't talk to women and girls without knowing the story of their grannies and their aunties and their older sisters and the people who came before them. Women are very much the keeper of the family story. You learn the history, and it's, you know what, Ben, it's very, very hard to go against the history of your granny. I'm thinking of the women of Malikunda Bambara in Senegal, who were the first to eradicate female genital mutilation. They call it excision cutting. They speak French. And I watched them, and I was very taken by their concern with throwing away the past. This is what our mothers did, our grannies did, our aunties did. Who are we going to be when we stop doing this? They knew it was something that had to be stopped. They knew it was detrimental to their health. They knew it was taking all their hard-earned shillings as adults because of the health problems they had because of this. But if you don't examine the past, if you don't examine your hook to the past, then I think you're making a mistake. And everywhere I go, I see this happening. And these women went to their imams, and they went to their chiefs, and they went to their grannies, and they asked basically for their blessing. And I find this everywhere I go, that the history, you know what, you're speaking of destroying history. Look at the Buddhist statues in Bamiyan. I was there. And the people of Bamiyan, it's a very spiritual place, you know. You can practically feel the spirituality. You know those places where the trees kind of whisper to you, and it's really spectacular, Bamiyan. And the people are such lovely people. And those Buddhist statues have been there for, I think, 2,000 years, standing over the people of Bamiyan. And it's so much a part of their lives. It's so much a part of who they are, even though it has nothing to do with their own religion. And to destroy them was so hard. The Taliban tried everything. They tried throwing rocks at them. They tried throwing bombs at them. Do you know that finally, in order to destroy them, the Taliban lowered Hazara men by their feet with their hands full of explosives, and they were to tuck those explosives into parts of the Buddhist statues so that they could finally blow them up. I mean, the lengths they went to destroy a link, it tells you the mentality of that person. They also want to destroy women and girls. I get it. There's something wrong with you.
There's a destructive tendency to a lot of our politics, even in the Western world today, this need to just protest, whether it's at the ballot box or to just say, I don't believe in the system anymore, and I let it all go to hell. A lot of people have this sensibility now. Maybe it's a very male-dominated sensibility. A lot of journalists have said so. But I guess my question is, why is it, I mean, kind of what we were going to, we were talking about a bit before, that what is the personal reason why these boys did these things? And everyone had a different personal answer. But underneath all of that, there must have been a commonality. What is the commonality to this need to turn to violence and destruction, especially the destruction of heritage and history, this link, this hook that you mentioned to the past?
You're taught. Now, the Taliban were taken to those madrasa schools, and they were not taught physics and mathematics and chemistry. They were taught hatred. We know that to be true. We've seen the curriculums. They were taught hatred, and they were taught this very bizarre interpretation of the Quran. There's nothing in the Quran to say this. There's nothing in the Quran to say a woman can't go to school or has to cover her face or anything like that. They made it up as they went along. One of the reasons could be, by the way, is in Afghanistan, the languages are Dari and Farsi. They don't speak Arabic, and the Quran is written in Arabic. So and most of the mullahs are illiterate anyway. So they're making stuff up as they go along, spewing out this stuff, and so then you say to yourself, well, why did you let your child go to that school? You know what? If I was living in Kandahar and my child was starving because I couldn't feed him, and someone came along and said, give him to me, I'll take him to school and I'll feed him, I'd say okay. So it comes back to the same things we were talking about: poverty, lack of information, and the world is changing very rapidly now. The idea of education has caught on even more than before. We know how important that is. We better understand poverty, not well enough to stop it, but we better understand it. We know that it is the root of a lot of these problems. But then there's this violent side of my way or the doorway, and that is being promoted today by populist governments. I mean, you know, recently the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Guterres, made a speech, and he said, we are suffering in the world from a trust deficit disorder. I have to be honest, I was writing a speech the other day about that, and I, by mistake, wrote a Trump deficit disorder. So you can see where my head was going with that. But we because of the way the President of the United States speaks about people, we've suddenly got a platform for racists, misogynists, people who have suddenly felt they can say whatever the heck they want, no censorship, and also that they come to the stage with an attitude of my ignorance is just as good as your facts. So this is a problem. This is like a virus, and that populist movement is moving in a lot of places in the world, and that I can tell you is very bad for women. I mean, in places like Hungary, Poland, even Italy, the Balkan states that split up, the churches are starting to move in and pull back the rights of women. They're against LGBTQ rights, they're against abortion rights, and this populism is feeding into that.
It's interesting because I think that most people's beliefs are not black and white. They're gray, right? And by that I mean that until we're forced to really pick a side, we're happy to imagine how things could be on the other side. My point is that when Donald Trump, and it really isn't relevant to me whether or not he is a white supremacist or a racist or not. I mean, he seems to be, but it makes no difference because the actions have the same impact. The actions that he has opened the door to have the same result. That I think the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, which is bizarre in the year 2019, is impossible to imagine 5 years ago. If you were to do a poll, I'd assume there's probably a tenth as many people who are involved in that movement that are involved today. Those beliefs were elastic and they weren't sure of them, and now they've hardened with the opportunity and the platform that he's given them. But I want to go back to something that you said a few moments ago about history and about the need to have that hook with the past. When we talk about this, we're talking about literacy and illiteracy. There was a girl or a woman, I can't remember which, who said to you that being illiterate is the same as being blind.
Yes.
And you asked why, and she said, well, because I can't see what's going on.
Yeah, I couldn't read, so I couldn't see what was going on.
Right, and I found that so powerful. And one of the themes of this podcast is literacy, and whether it's climate and science literacy or media literacy, so they understand the difference between fake news and what's really, rigidly and empirically researched. Literacy is so important, and if we destroy literacy, or if we bring people into schools where they're not learning to be literate but simply learning to follow an ideology, then we are actually blinding ourselves. It reminds me of a scene from Slumdog Millionaire where a boy is blinded in order to beg more effectively. Well, that boy might actually be better off as a result of his blindness than someone who can't beg as well. But that belies the whole point, that you shouldn't have to beg, that it's opportunities that need to be present in order to prevent us from wanting our children to be blind or illiterate. What can you say about this notion of literacy being so important and illiteracy being blindness?
Well, you just said it all. And we know this to be true. And every organization in the world today is working toward educating all of the children and all of the girls. The girls often were not invited to go to school. Or, we went through a period of time where we would donate money to a country to build schools. And it was in the hands of people who felt they shouldn't be doing this. So they put the schools in places the children couldn't access. They did the same thing with hospitals and women. We have a hospital, but she can't go to it. So you accomplished your goal. Literacy is it. In every story I have ever covered, whether it's about women's rights, whether it's in the middle of a civil war, whether it is in the middle of a famine, it's all about literacy. If you can read, you can figure it out yourself. And that's a very powerful tool to deny a person the right to read, because then they can't figure it out for themselves. They have to believe you. So it's just another tool to stop progress, to stop people.
Do you think that that's being challenged or frustrated by the age of social media, where lots of people can read all kinds of things, but the issue is becoming that something that is empirically researched and something that is just made up look equivalent?
Well, I'll tell you the flip side to that. When I was doing stories on those Yazidi girls, and I got very close to those girls, I went back a few times, and they wanted to be in touch with me. The two girls that I profiled, actually, for The Current on CBC, they're both illiterate. Their father didn't send them to school because there were boys in the school, and they didn't want their girls near those boys. Not Yazidi boys, they were boys from the neighborhood, the township. And they were illiterate. And yet, they wanted me to come back there and they figured out a way because of social media. They knew how to use their phones. They knew how to look things up. They couldn't read a lot of it, but that's how you learn to read, I mean, our society is so filled with tools for reading. We know what A and W means. We know what that great big B means. Our children are socialized through words and letters, and that's the easiest way to learn to read. Someone tells you the sounds they make, and basically you can take it from there. These girls are illiterate. When I was with them last, they were 14 and 15, and they were picking up cell phones and figuring out what things meant. So there's a great boost in literacy, if you will, not the way you and I would want it to happen. But so to come back to your side of it, I mean, as a former English teacher, I'm appalled at the way we cut language and use signs and frankly, the sense that grammar is not important. Someone told me the other day, that's so old-fashioned, you don't have to worry about that. Yeah, you do have to worry about that. So bad grammar is bad grammar.
But why is that? And I agree with you. I'm don't want to say I'm a snob, but maybe I am, and I think that good grammar and spelling and the full word as opposed to the abbreviation is important to know. I think that it's part of how we think. And if we think in an abbreviated way, then we will be abbreviated thinkers. But there are some who argue that, it's not that big of a deal, that we're liberated to think about other things. It's the classic Silicon Valley argument that if Google can remember things for you and you don't need to remember them, you can focus your mind on higher things, on greater pleasures or whatever. I don't buy it, but why is the proper use of the English language, or any language for that matter, so important?
It's the same reason that building a home that won't collapse in an earthquake is important. If you start with a foundation that is strong and it will protect you, it'll work no matter what you're doing. It is simply wrong to let a language collapse. Look how hard the people of Quebec struggled to make sure French stayed as their... Look what they did, really, when you look back over those years of the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. That took a big struggle, but it was important enough to those people to preserve their language, to make sure it was the spoken language, it was not damaged. That's foundational, and I think language is foundational.
I agree with you. It animates our thinking, right? It is the way most of us think. But do you think that someone who doesn't have language in the same way, comes to it maybe when they're 14 or 16, I mean, do they have a different way of viewing the world, of seeing the world? And is it possible how hard is it to bring literacy to someone who lacked it for so long?
I don't think it's hard. I think, sadly, that depends on your ability to learn. And, look at all the people who are coming here as refugees, and they're going to English as a second language class. Some of them fly through those classes. Some of them are stumbling after many years. But your ability to learn is going to affect everything in your life, sadly. And until we find some miracle to change that, we have techniques. We know how to teach people things. But you might fly through it, and I might struggle through it, and that we haven't really altered that.
Right.
And yet, you can teach a 60-year-old person a new language, and they can become very proficient in the language.
One thing that I really appreciate about Sally in our conversation is her ability to answer a question in a sharp and straightforward way and then go on about it in detail. For example, I asked her, why violence? She said, you're taught. You're not taught physics or chemistry or math. You're taught hatred. You're taught a perverse interpretation of, for example, the Quran, and out of hate from that perspective. Now, coming up in this conversation, we talk about dialogue, the importance of having a conversation. It's one of the key themes to Sally's work. How do we make talking the most important aspect of resolving conflict? I think the answer is in her writing and in her conversation with me. That's coming up on this episode of What on Earth is Going On. You've given me, Sally, a brilliant segue into asking you, because I think that you, and it's evident through your work, are an incredible learner. your curiosity has animated you in your career. It's just obvious that you have an insatiable appetite for learning, for language, but for understanding not just what's in books, but what people's individual personal stories are. And that's just so clear, and I have to ask you, what drives you? What's driven you all this time? What makes you want to learn more stories when you could easily hang your hat and say, I've had a great career? I mean, I'm an Order of Canada recipient. I've written articles, been interviewed by Peter Mansbridge, as I mentioned earlier, and yet all of that seems second nature to you, or not second nature, second to the point, secondary. And your primary concern is to be driven by this curiosity. And I just wonder, well, first of all, am I right? And second of all, why?
Well, first of all, I love my job. I really do love my job, and you're right. I should stop doing it.
That's not what I'm saying.
Every time I come home from assignment, I think that's the last one, and then somebody calls and says, "Why don't you just do this one?"
Please, Sally. I'm not saying to quit. Anyway, sorry.
No, I'm just having fun with it. I love my job. I love what I do, and being on assignment. You know, you're very privileged as a journalist because you get to ask all the questions. Of course, you have to do your homework. You have to prepare. You have to learn as much as you can. But basically, you're there to be taught. You're there for someone to tell you. And once they start to talk, they want to share everything with you. They want to tell you the whole story. And I absorb that like candy. I love hearing these stories. I'll tell you one. Sometimes it's very hard to get a story, even when it should be easy. The last big story I did, maybe it's not the last one, but recently, I did a story on the rescue of the white helmets out of Syria. And that whole rescue was masterminded by Canada. So I knew that on July 21st they were rescued. But then I heard from somebody that Canada did it all. I thought, what a story. I want to find out how do you do that? I don't know what diplomats do in their job. I don't know what envoys do in their job. And it seems to me they were the ones at work here. So I called to ask for interviews with people like our ambassador in Israel, our ambassador in Jordan, our envoy to Syria, and I wasn't getting anywhere. And finally I said to the person I was dealing with at Global Affairs, what the heck is going on here? Don't you think Canadians deserve to know that our people masterminded this extraordinary rescue and kept it all a secret? Well, finally they said yes, that I could have the interviews. And Ben, once they said yes, it was about the easiest assignment I ever went on because all the doors opened up and everybody was telling me. But what I learned on that assignment, I knew what the white helmets were doing. They're the bravest people on the planet. And they were really like a high-octane neighborhood watch coming in to rescue the people in their own villages and towns and cities that Assad was bombing because he had removed all their rescue equipment. And so I knew they were heroes. I knew they were doing terrific work. And I knew that he'd called for their death. But the way Canada worked to get them out of there, I mean, it was like a whodunit. And they did it brilliantly, and they succeeded. And I love telling that story, but it taught me so much about the behind the scenes of what goes on in our embassies, what goes on with our envoys. I think I knew a lot about what they did in terms of development aid and humanitarian assistance. But here I had interviews with these clever, strategic people who against all odds, pulled off this extraordinary rescue. I was thrilled to get that information.
Why were they so hesitant to fess up to it, so to speak, at the beginning? Was it just classic Canadian humility, or why?
Well, I think that's part of it. I think that's very much part of who we are. We don't blow our own horn. But I think there's also a level of fear of the government allowing journalists on the inside. And I suppose if you've been burned, you might worry about that, or maybe it's a little paranoia. But also, there is that sort of creed among diplomats that you don't go public. And I think there's something very important about that, too, because they do a heck of a lot behind the scenes that if we knew about, probably it would interrupt their work. You know, when we hear of somebody being held somewhere and we say, oh, why the heck isn't the government doing something about that? my impression is that the government's doing a lot about that, and people with great skill are working on it, and they can't go public or they would wreck their job. So I think it's a combination of things.
It's a very honorable profession, that of the diplomat, and yet one that seems to be under siege right now, in the same way that journalism seems to be under siege in many ways. I mean, it's under siege as a result of technology. It's under siege as a result of populism and ideology, and the fact that people just want to read within their own echo chamber or watch within their own echo chamber. And it's reinforced, of course, by, say, Netflix, who will only give you what's recommended to you. They don't need you to watch stuff that's going to challenge you. Do you think that we're living in a time of flux right now where, say, journalism as well as diplomacy, foreign affairs is all kind of on the edge of a knife? Or are we being what's called chronocentric? Are we privileging our own time as special and we're actually just on the long march of progress?
Well, I think we are on the long march of progress, but I think this is a blip in the road. We are at a time that I would be concerned. For example, you were talking about journalism. People tell me, I don't get the paper, I don't watch the news, I get everything on my phone. You know what? I don't believe that. I think what you're getting on your phone is a headline, and you're able to go with the headline and make up the rest. People can't go deep on a topic. They can't do an analysis of why a decision was made, and I think that short shrift of news is hurting us. It feeds a democracy. It makes a democracy work, and we have to know what is going on. And it's our job as journalists to pull people to account. And so people who, you know what, I have 3 adult children. They all read the newspaper. They read more than one newspaper a day. So I don't know where this is growing, that you only need to check a headline on your phone to be well informed. I don't think you're well informed.
And do you think that, there's a lot of people who probably don't feel like they want to be well informed, or they don't need to be well informed, and don't maybe even never heard the argument that democracy only functions if we read the newspaper or read what's happening around us and try to understand what on earth is going on. So how do we, as a greater society, as journalists, as thinkers, how do we correct the needle on this, or do we even have to? I guess my question about the long march of progress is, will things just sort themselves out, or does this require us to take action now to make sure that people are paying attention?
You know what I think is going to happen? I think some young person, maybe like you, is going to come up with an idea we haven't thought of before. And it's going to create a whole new method of distributing news, collecting news, distributing news, engaging the public in the conversation they need to be engaged in. I think it's out there, and I think I have great faith in the people who are looking at this kind of problem. And I believe some young person is going to say, hey, how about this? And it's going to fly.
I like your optimism, and I hope that happens. And I don't know what, obviously, that would look like, but I think we're all asking for it. I think it's a demand that we have. And going back to the Silicon Valley thinkers, they're always trying to put themselves 5 years from now. Sending notes from the future is what they used to say Google does.
But look how quickly Google and Facebook took off. It was like in a nanosecond. And I was reading a piece the other day that when Google started, they felt this was going to be the formula for world peace. Can you imagine? Here they are trying to back away from suits that are being taken to court because they're lying about people. So whoever reinvents the news, I think should learn from the mistakes Google and Facebook have made. It's not only about making money. It's not only about hoisting yourself up to the top of the hill. It's about informing the people.
Mm-hmm. And having a conversation, I think, having that dialogue, which you have been so good at in your career. I think that's probably a word that would have to be in any first sentence on your biography, I would say, is dialogue or conversation. Because I get the sense that in no way are you imposing your beliefs on the person that you're speaking with, but at the same time, you're an active participant. You're not just a recipient of someone's story. You challenge them and you ask them to to meet you at a higher level than maybe that they thought they could be. And it just seems like you have a really great knack at challenging the person that you're asking questions of, regardless of their circumstance. There are people that I've seen you interview who, aren't some would say aren't qualified to be at your intellectual level, and yet you challenge them to be there, and they're better for it, even if they're a boy in prison, in a hotel management course in Iraq.
Everybody has so much to say. Everybody has a story. Everybody has a point of view, and we either put them down and tell them we don't want to hear their point of view, or we try to train them to have somebody else's point of view. If you leave all that to one side and say, tell me your story, honestly, it's the best fun. And they'll tell you things you didn't know before, and they'll enrich your life with the stories of theirs. I love it. I just love it.
So let me try something then, Sally. Tell me your story. I know we've been talking now for close to 40 minutes, but I still want to just ask you, and it's not the same thing as what drives you, but what's your story?
My story. I'm a journalist, and I chase news and shape that into stories that I think inform readers or listeners or viewers about things that I think they might want to know about. And I love doing that.
And part of that story is you unearth things that we don't see, and you make them seen.
That's possible. That's a very nice compliment you pay to me, and I think it's possible that I see something that I feel needs more attention, and that someone else might have overlooked it.
So then my question then would be, if there was one thing that you could have all of us see that we don't currently see, or most of us don't currently see, what would that one thing be? If there was one thing you could wave a magic wand and the whole world could understand, what would that one thing be?
It's so hard to say one thing. I do have children and grandchildren. I guess if I had to go with one thing, I would say if the world could suddenly, miraculously, instantly change their view toward women and girls, we would have less poverty, we'd have less conflict, we'd have more information, we would have better means of settling disputes. All of these things that women and girls can bring to the table are the missing pieces in many of the most intractable files we have in the world. And that might sound a bit Pollyannish, but it's true, and I can prove it. So if I could wave a magic wand, it would be to change the thinking around women and girls instantly.
That would be a wonderful thing, and I think a follow-up question to that would be, what would you say to women and girls who are trying to be leaders today, and leader can mean many things. It doesn't have to be leading an organization, being a CEO, but to be at the forefront of something and to change the world. What would be your advice to them?
I meet them all the time, and I love talking to them. And the world is so open to them. The world it's as though we've been doing set decoration for the last 3 decades. And it's these young girls can walk onto this set, and they can make their thoughts known. They're learning all along the way, and people are interested in mentoring them. Mentoring was not something we did with girls, and certainly not in my young years. But I would say to them, go for it. You can do it, and don't be cowed by the people who say, oh, we've been there, we tried that, it didn't work, or there's 500 people applying for the one job. Never mind. You go for your dream because you can make it happen.
I love that idea. And last question to you, Sally. If there was one thing that we haven't addressed in this conversation, that if we had another podcast to do, what would that one thing be that you and I could address, or that you're just, and maybe it's your Massey lectures, maybe you can just spill it all out right now, but what would the one thing be that you'd really want to dig into, or maybe a story that you haven't unearthed yet? What would that one thing be?
There is something that's on my mind, and it's a bit complicated. We're having a problem with refugees right now. There's a lot of people on the run. They're on the run for environmental reasons. They're on the run to get away from violence. They're on the run from poor governments. They're on the run for a reason. Nobody leaves home because it was a better place to stay. And I feel concerned about our lack of preparedness for trying to get them home again. Because that's where people want to be. The Yazidis want to go home. The Rohingya want to go home. It doesn't seem to me that it is so difficult for us to prepare a situation that they're safe to go home. They don't want you to rebuild their house or build their road. They'll do that themselves. They want you to have their back. They want to know that they're safe and this isn't going to happen again. And I don't think it's terribly hard for us to provide that kind of thing through the old-fashioned peacekeeping or, Canada's exceptionally good at this. If you were to string a bunch of our brilliantly trained military along Shengal Mountain and say to the Yazidis, go on home, we got your back. You know what? It would work. The Rohingya, they need to go home. And so let's just do a number crunch. There's 450,000 Yazidis sitting in refugee camps. Their land that they've occupied for 8,000 years is empty. They want to go home. So if I could tackle another item, that would be it. It would be how to get people safely back home.
There's such an interesting insight in that, though, too, that what we often frame the refugee crisis around the world or the migration crisis around the world as well, who's going to accept these people in their new home, right? Are they going to become new Canadians and new Americans and new people in Britain, France, wherever? And that's important. There are many people who want to move to new countries and become a new Canadian, and that's part of the way the modern world works, and that's not, I think, at all what we're talking about. But most people want to go home, and they should go home because otherwise, what is home? What is your locality? We have to build our communities where they are at, not where they will be in 20 years. And I think that there's an interesting paradigm shift there that might need to take place, that we need to make sure that people can go home, and we need to put a bit of maybe muscle or heft behind that in order to make it happen. And I don't know if we're talking about interventions in countries that would rather not, such as Myanmar with the Rohingya, and allowing, I think 700, 800,000 people to go home, but it's unsustainable to have people living in camps or to have people living in this weird flux in between things. It's just not the way the world works in any sustainable way. And I think what you're saying about going home is something that anybody could recognize. Anybody we all have a home, even if it was something we haven't seen for many, many years. And I think that it's an interesting and an important antidote to a culture where we're always talking about the new home. If you were to tell that story now, or if you were to write that article now, or we were to do another episode of this podcast about that, do you think that the key debate in that would be the fight between intervention and non-intervention? And one thing you've said before about female genital mutilation is that it's not cultural, it's criminal, and that therefore intervention is not about do we respect someone else's culture, but do we stop criminal behavior? Do you think that that's the main framing, or do we also have to talk about the deeper economic and social and political factors that are at play as well?
I don't think it's the economic and social factors that are at play. I think those are, you can handle them. Look at the brilliant people on this file, people like Lloyd Axworthy, people like Paul Heimbecker. They know exactly how to do this. I think the problem is politics. If we are going to continue to support a government that does that to their people, how are you going to stop it? And we do support them. Look at Saudi Arabia, for heaven's sakes. We continue to support people. We can cut people off in a nanosecond, but there's always that playback with politics, with business. I'm willing to look the other way in the mining situation because I'm going to make a lot of money. So someone has to come to terms with that piece of it. And I believe that down the road, they're going to, because we're not only going to have the people like the Syrians running away from Assad, which they really needed to run away from, or the Yazidis running away from ISIS. You're going to have the environmental refugees as land starts to disappear. So I think we have to have a better idea going forward because, as you've said and I said, people want to go home.
And there's more coming. Sally, this has been a really wonderful conversation. Thank you for taking my questions even after I said this is my last question.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
I appreciate it. To learn more about Sally Armstrong, go to the website whatonearthisgoingon.ca. There you can find all previous episodes, as well as a way to get in touch with me. Let me know what you think of this episode or any other. Give me your suggestions for future guests or future subjects to discuss on this show. And of course, if you can, give me a rating on iTunes or whatever podcast app that you use. Now, your quote of the week is from Sally Armstrong's book, Ascent of Women. And it goes, "Talking is the antidote for oppression and injustice." Thanks, as always, to our composer Andrea Wetstein for giving us this wonderful music, and special thanks to Over Easy Breakfast in Toronto, Ontario, for giving us the space in which to record. Next week, we're talking about history with a professor of history at the University of Toronto, Ken Bartlett. I'll see you then.